Let me call this meeting of the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee to order and introduce myself. I'm John McGlennon. I am the chair of TSDAC and am a member of the James City County Board of Supervisors, and I'm here representing the Virginia Association of Counties. And I'll now ask the other members to identify themselves. First, the TSDAC members, and Cindy Mestre, I'll begin with you.
Good morning, Chair and all. Thank you for that. Cindy Mestre. I am in the City Manager's Office of the City of Falls Church. Have the honor of serving as Vice Chair for TSDAC and represent VML.
Great, thank you. And let's move along. Maybe Dr. Smoot.
Good morning. This is Raymond Smoot, a member of the Commonwealth Transportation Board.
Great, thank you. Kate Mattice.
Good morning, Kate Mattice. I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, and I'm here representing the Virginia Transit Association.
Great. Sam?
Take care. We gonna take care.
I'm sorry. Go. Other members of the committee. I don't see them all on my screen here. So.
Good
Brian?
morning. I'm sorry, I jumped in. My name is Noelle Pinkert. I'm with Hampton Roads Transit, and I represent the Virginia Transit Association as well. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I'm Brian Booth, the director here at Blacksburg Transit, and I am the representative of CTAB.
And is Jamie? Director Robinson, good morning.
Good morning. It's great to see everybody's faces. I'm the DRPT director, and I'm thrilled that technology seems to be working for us this morning. So thank you for everyone joining a little bit early.
Great. Anybody else on TSDAC that I've missed? And so, Zach, how about the staff? Dan, maybe you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
So I'm Zach Trogdon, Chief Public Transportation. I guess just on behalf to keep the meeting moving forward. We have a couple staff here from our planning and program management team. So look forward to speaking with you all today. Thank you.
Great. And we'll have an opportunity to hear from our consultants in just a little bit, but other staff members, Grant, I see you're there.
Yep. Good morning, everyone. Grant Sparks, Director of Statewide Transit Programs, DRPT.
And Dan?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. This is Dan Sonnenklar, Statewide Transit Planning Manager. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else from staff that I should have introduced?
Tiffany Dubinsky, you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm Tiffany Dubinsky. I'm a Director of Transit Planning.
Great. Okay, I'll assume that we've pretty well covered that. We have a number of folks who are joining us. I see the count is up to about 66 this morning. We have as I say, an interesting and somewhat complicated set of presentations today as we consider the possibility of adjustment of the funding formulas. Let me first say that on our agenda, we have as our next item the adoption of minutes. We've had a request for some amendments to that set of minutes, and so I'm going to ask if there's any objection to deferring approval of the minutes of the July meeting to our next meeting.
So moved.
Great. We have a motion to do so. All in favor? I'm sorry?
Second if needed.
Okay, second. Okay. Any discussion? If not, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? And any abstentions? All right, so we will defer approval of these minutes until we've had an opportunity to incorporate amendments, and present them at our next meeting. Okay. So that does move us right along to the meat of our meeting today, which is the merit review findings. And we have our consultants that will be handling that presentation, as I understand it.
Yes, we will. Director Robinson, was there anything you wanted to say to tee this up?
Thanks, Nate. I will just say that our team has been working hard to kind of revise and add additional explanation and information based on previous TSDAC member questions received. We've also been broadly out talking about this review and getting feedback all over the Commonwealth in presentations to VML and BACO and CTB and VTA. We have email lists that go out to over 40,000 people with my director's report, where we gave an overview and a summary, and to share this information as well. So I just wanted to mention that. It's been a long few months, and I really appreciate the TSDAC members for kind of jumping into this really complex methodology as we take on our role of reviewing this merit allocation funding method every 3 years as required by statute. This presentation, I hope is going to help pull together kind of all the work we've done and show you additional aspects of the funding methodology, how it's worked in the past, and why we had some of the concerns and challenges that we are trying to address moving forward. And it shows additional scenarios that were asked for, and tries to give the members a picture of all the work that we've done to come to a place where we have some recommendations or proposals that we want to consult with you on. So with that, Nate, thank you for all your and your team's hard work, and I'll turn it over to you for the presentation.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll get things started here. What we're planning to do is to follow up on some of the materials that we presented at the last meeting in July. There were lots of great questions that came out of the discussion. So we're going to follow up on those points with some additional detail to help answer some of the questions that we received. So this is an agenda of what we're hoping to cover here. We're going to do a little bit of review just to make sure we set the table in terms of the current process, talk a little bit about the key scenarios we've considered, provide some additional detail on some of the other scenarios that were considered as part of this analysis, and then dive into that sizing plus performance adjustment scenario, which we think is the key approach here. So we've got some additional graphs and summaries of that to delve into that in a little bit more detail. We want to summarize how everything aligns with the goals that have been outlined for this study, and then remind everybody of the potential alternative approaches and limitations. So that's the capital side of this that I'll be presenting. And again, my name is Nate Masick. I'm a consultant to DRPT and work for HDR. And for the capital assistance program review, we'll have my colleagues from Kimley Horn who will be presenting that. And we are a team of consultants that's working on this. And Kimley Horn is focused on the capital assistance program review, and we'll have an update to some of the questions heard last time on that. And then we'll summarize with next steps. So we're going to jump into the operating assistance program review first. And we want to start with a reminder of what the current approach looks like. We've seen this a number of times at the past few TSDAC meetings. And as a reminder, there are two major components of the current formula: a sizing metric that basically allocates an initial amount of funding to agencies on the basis of several sizing metrics. Operating cost is 50% of that, ridership is 30% of that, and then vehicle revenue hours and vehicle revenue miles are each 10% of that sizing metric formula. And I wanted to clarify too that vehicle revenue hours and miles that DRPT presently uses in the formula, and for all scenarios we'll be presenting today, does include deadhead miles for commuter bus services, which are defined as bus routes that are greater than 20 miles in length. So because those routes have somewhat unique service patterns where they're entirely deadhead back to the home base or home community if after reaching the central city or their ultimate destination, there's a special allowance for those routes to have their deadhead miles counted in the vehicle revenue hours and miles. So we wanted to clarify that and note that here. That's part of the current formula, and that data would continue to be used for any of the scenarios that we're presenting here as potential proposals. There's a second step to the formula with a trend adjustment that adjusts the amounts that agencies receive based on sizing on the basis of several performance adjustments. And then there's a redistribution that happens in part because agencies are capped at receiving no more than 30% of their prior year operating cost in merit formula assistance. So there's in order to reallocate all of the funds, the amounts that would go to any agencies that would receive more than 30% by formula are iterated and go back to the beginning of the process. So that's the current approach, and some of the things that we're looking at as part of this study are what we would outline as the goals of this particular round of evaluation. Number one, promoting an emphasis on outcome-focused metrics, so ridership and service versus income-focused metrics like operating cost. Number two, emphasizing a performance-based allocation, which is what the statute requires, and finding ways to tune the allocation approach to emphasize that. Number three, formula simplification. Because of the various iterations that happen as part of this, it's a somewhat complex formula at the moment, and so we're interested in ways of simplifying the formula. And number four, trying to provide some year-over-year predictability in allocation so that agencies have a sense of how much money they might be receiving from one year to the next as a result of that. So those are the goals that we broadly outlined here for this effort. I wanted to note, too, as some additional context that we do see some variation in operating allocation at present with the current amounts that are allocated to transit agencies through the merit formula, that because every year the amount of funds that's available for distribution through the TSDAC, through the merit operating assistance formula varies, and because the metrics that the agencies submit that are the basis for the allocations, not only for individual agencies, but also on a statewide basis, vary. There is some variance in terms of how much each agency might see in its growth or change in funds from year to year. So what the table on the left tees up is the fact that this is for the construction districts that comprise different areas of the state. We've seen over the past few years of bouncing around of just year-over-year allocations with the existing formula that some agencies have been up by as much as 37% in one year. Some have been down by some allocations. This is on a district basis, have been down by as much as 14% in one year. And you can see, if you look at that on the basis of individual agencies, you can see the range in how much agencies have been up and down. So table on the left is by construction district. Graphs on the right are for agencies. And the graph at the top right is the change that agencies saw in their 24 to 25 allocations. So, a lot were right around the median, seeing plus or minus anywhere from minus 15 to plus 25%. But there were some outliers that did see declines in the range of 35 to 25%. And 25 to 15%, and then some that saw a gain of 45 to 55%, in part because of some significant changes in service that might have happened for some very small agencies. And then we also see changes from 25 to 26, where you can see what the trend there. Not quite as much of a tail on the distributions for 25 to 26, but still some that were for agencies that saw declines of 15 to 25%. And again, this is just year over year changes using the existing formula, in part because of how the metrics change and affect agencies from year to year. We provide this as context because I think it's helpful to help understand that the current formula does cause some bouncing around of the funds from year to year. And we're always going to have some noise in terms of how much agencies are seeing their funds change from year to year, just because we're using a dynamic basis for allocating funds.
Nate,
so I wanted to provide
Nate, can I jump in?
Yeah.
I just want to
Yes.
jump in because I think Kate has a question.
And for some reason, my raised hand is disabled. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, Tiffany. And thank you, Nate. One of the things I think we all recognize is there's been an incredible amount of volatility in the last 3 to 5 years on transit in general. Have you looked at how this trend was sort of pre-pandemic? Because I think it's interesting to see how perhaps now things are normalizing, right? So it's hard to, I think, to look back the last 3 years and say, of course, we all, I think, can recognize there's volatility. So I just didn't know if there'd actually been an examination of sort of how things were sort of 18 to 20 in terms of that, or maybe just using these new formula, if you had gone back and looking at the trends, if you would have seen the same sort of volatility.
So we know that there's been noise in the allocations going back to the beginning of these approaches. So we know that there's bouncing of trends that occurs. So we don't have the numbers in graph form, but there has been some. You're correct that the impacts of COVID and the fact that led to some declines in some cases service levels, and in a lot of cases ridership, and in some cases operating costs, that then would drive changes in what the allocations would be, that there has been some volatility in recent years. But things are starting to kind of normalize out, and we're still seeing in the last couple of years that there's still variation year over year in terms of what agencies are receiving.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. All right, so we'll keep rolling here, and want to talk about the scenarios that we considered as part of the analysis. So last time, the scenario that we focused on exclusively was the sizing plus performance adjustment scenario. And this is a simplified view of some of what we presented last time, which shows on the right-hand side the approach. So you see that the revenue sizing metric has changed here for this to be 35% operating cost, 35% ridership, 15% vehicle revenue hours, 15% vehicle revenue miles. So what we're effectively changing is that operating cost is a smaller share of the revenue sizing metric, and that ridership, vehicle revenue hours, and vehicle revenue miles are each a greater share. I would also again clarify, and throughout the presentation, that vehicle revenue hours and vehicle revenue miles does include deadhead miles for commuter bus services for the routes that qualify that are greater than 20 miles in length. The other change that we're making as part of this formula is that we set aside 5% of the funds plus any of the funds that are available after capping out agencies at 30%, and do a performance-based allocation that is on the basis of 50% passengers per operating cost, 25% passengers per vehicle revenue hour, 25% passengers per vehicle revenue mile. And that's in place of the existing step 2 of the current formula, which makes it trend-wise adjustments to the sizing metrics that agencies receive. And as we saw last time, there were some reductions on a district basis in Northern Virginia and Fredericksburg, seeing a decline of 3% and 7% respectively over a 3-year average. So these results that we're presenting here look at the average allocations by district over a 3-year period, FY24 through the FY26 allocations that agencies are currently receiving. We also saw increased allocations for Lynchburg, Richmond, Salem, and the Hampton Roads districts. Okay, so just a little bit of review, and that's in part to sort of set the table because we're going to be presenting some additional scenarios in a moment that present the information in the same way. So we wanted to make sure you had a consistent format for the scenario we presented last time. And I do see a question there from Ms. Mattice.
Thanks again, Nate. So just really we've got a lot of people on the call. Can you explain what are the types of transit service characteristics that are really being rewarded by this change in formula? What are the types of transit services that would do well in this formula? Is that possible to explain sort of plain language so we understand the data?
Driven in large part by by the types of services that agencies operate. So those that have high ridership are going to see a gain under this mechanism because ridership is is increasing in terms of its proportion of the revenue sizing metric. And those that have higher vehicle revenue hours and vehicle revenue miles of service operated by other agencies elsewhere in the state are going to see an increase in service. And then those that have higher operating costs, in part because this could be because their cost structures are different, or they are modes that have higher costs to operate because of some of the built-in features of those modes, would potentially see a lower allocation under this approach. The other thing that operating cost is a bit of a proxy, as we've discussed in previous meetings, for some of the variation in the services that exist. So it's the same formula that's used for paratransit, for fixed route bus, for commuter bus, for the light rail system in Hampton Roads. So all of these are all using the same metrics to receive funding through this formula. And some of those modes have higher operating costs as a result of the inherent nature of those services. So those might include and light rail in particular. And that's why operating costs, while we consider scenarios that eliminated operating costs, this particular scenario continues to include it, in part because it does recognize the inherent differences in those cost structures for those services, as well as regional variation in the operating costs throughout the state. I will keep rolling here.
Does that satisfy
So
your?
that's just a little bit of review.
Thank you.
Great. Let's see there. Okay, so as a reminder, we also looked at a number of different scenarios that did a number of other changes to the formula. So the scenario we're looking at includes an element of approach one where we're adjusting the size and weight, and an element of approach two where there's a performance-based allocation of the redistribution set aside. So this is kind of a hybrid approach that combines a couple of things, but there were also some other elements that we considered, eliminating the iteration that happens because of the 30% cap. We looked at scenarios that just did a performance-based allocation of redistribution. We looked at some that did attempted to have higher predictability by capping the growth in funds that agencies could receive. And what we want to do is, given all those scenarios that we looked at, we would like to look at a few of these in detail. The ones that were, what we heard last time was, well, what was the second best scenario that we also considered as part of this? And what we're going to present are four other approaches that were kind of runners up here that had some promising features and were mechanisms that might address some of the goals that were set out as part of the purpose of this study, but for various reasons, as we'll discuss here, had some drawbacks that maybe made them not as preferable as the sizing plus performance-based approach that is the scenario we presented last time. So these are the 4 scenarios we're going to look at, and we're going to step through each of these individually. The first one, scenario A, only adjusts the sizing portion of this, and it changes the proportion of sizing, but it doesn't change step 2, and it doesn't change the redistribution function that currently exists, the iteration that exists in the current formula. Scenario B removed cost from sizing. So we took cost out entirely, and we just were talking a moment ago about cost and the role that it might play in allocating funds. And so you'll be able to see in this scenario what happens if we took cost out entirely. And again, in both A and B, we maintain step 2 as is, so they don't include changes to the performance adjustment portion of the formula. Scenario C considers an additional performance allocation. So what if we took that additional step that we're proposing as part of the sizing plus performance scenario and add that on as an additional factor in allocating funds in addition to the current steps 1 and 2. So we'll look at what that looks like. And then the 4th scenario, D, caps funding growth and says, basically, what if we use the existing formula, but we don't allow any agency to see a growth over a certain percent in terms of what its allocation might be year by year. And what I'm going to do is step through each of these individually here, unless there's any questions about sort of the 4 that we're looking at generally today.
Anybody have any questions for Nate at this point? I think you can go ahead then.
All right, so we'll keep rolling. The first is a sizing adjustment only. So here, what we're doing is only step 1, if we're looking at the change on the right. So the current approach is 50% operating costs, 30% ridership, 10% hours, 10% miles. And all this does is it changes the sizing metric and isolates the change in the sizing metric so that we see how that pencils out. So we don't change step 2, and we don't replace step 2 with that alternate step X that we presented in the other scenario. And when we do this, when we only change the sizing, what we see are some minor changes to the allocations, but it doesn't address any other goals. So the only thing that this does is it makes for more of an outcome-focused sizing metric than the current approach, but it doesn't really address any of the other goals that we've outlined for this study. And in terms of the changes in funding that we see, you can see on a district basis an increase for Richmond of about $533,000 annually, decreases for Northern Virginia of $733,000 annually, decrease for Hampton Roads of $332,000 annually. Those are about a 1% decline or a 1% difference in funding relative to what those agencies received in 2026. Well, it's about a 3% increase for Richmond. And then you can see that on a district basis, most of the other districts saw an increase in their funding. So 6 agencies did not see any change in their funds. In most cases, when agencies are unchanged, it's because they're already capping out at the 30% that they can get. So the amount doesn't change at all in any way. 7 agencies would lose funds. 25 agencies would gain funds under this approach. We do have, as part of the package, there's an appendix that has the results by agency. So those are available in the overall slide deck that is posted for the meeting, and are available if we need to pull up those slides to be able to see results by agency in any case. So that's the sizing adjustment only scenario. The second scenario we want to present which was considered, was removing cost entirely from sizing. So I'll draw your attention to step one in the graphic on the right. And what you'll see over here is we switched to 60% of the allocation is based on ridership, 20% based on hours, 20% based on miles. So it shifts entirely to an outcomes-based sizing approach without any operating cost being considered as part of this. So no sort of cost input is part of the sizing metric when we make this change. We would characterize this as a major change from the current approach, in part because of that kind of cushioning factor that operating cost has, given the differences in services operated across the state, and the fact that we don't have a good substitute for operating costs that we can suggest at this time. We've got a few that we might be able to look at in the future. We get to the end of this presentation, we'll remind you of some suggestions on data that could be collected in the future that might give us a better basis going forward. But for now, we don't have that data, and so we rely on using operating cost as a significant factor in determining the sizing. So when we do this, the first thing is, as we note, that it shifts to an outcomes-based sizing approach. It's a major change. Doesn't account for the higher cost of certain service types, such as commuter bus or light rail, or the regional variation in labor and operating costs that exists across the state. And we see a significant shift in allocations away from systems that serve major urban centers with this. So Northern Virginia sees the largest decline in dollar terms at 2.8 million, actually rounds up to 2.9 million, a 5% decrease. And Hampton Roads sees a $1.7 million decrease in funding, a 6% decrease. And we also see some large percentage change for Fredericksburg, an 8% decrease in funding with this approach. And then a large change in funding gain by other agencies in the state. So Richmond gains 3.8 million, a 19% increase in funding. Salem sees a $395,000 increase, a 5% increase. And Culpeper sees a $230,000 increase, a 6% increase for that district. So very significant changes as a result of this, and I think some concerns with that we had about the extent to which totally stripping cost out of the formula would provide the cushion and help to account for those variations in cost and both cost structures and regional costs that the current formula accounts for. Any questions on that before I move to the next one? All right, we'll go to scenario C. So this scenario basically added step X. So if you look at the diagram on the right, what we're doing here is we're keeping the existing formula as is. Sizing metrics haven't changed. The performance trend adjustments haven't changed. But we do have this additional trend, this step X, and what we're basically doing is, as I like to think of it, the crumbs that remain after the agencies that cap out at 30% state operating assistance are, instead of iterating that allocation, we do a special allocation using that. We do a special allocation of that using the step X approach that is part of we're proposing under the sizing plus performance scenario that we looked at during the last meeting. And when we do this, because we are only basically allocating the funds that remain after the 30% cap out, it isn't a lot of funds that get capped out. And it causes some very modest change in what agencies receive. You can see the change by district is between 0 and plus or minus. Isn't very significant. I mean, the biggest change here is a 2% increase of $300,000 approximately for the Richmond district. And what we concluded with this potential scenario is that it did not simplify the approach and it added complexity. So it is kind of an interesting way to provide some extra incentive with those funds that would otherwise be capped out because agencies can't receive more than 30% of funding. But it's
Nate, I think at least at my end, you're breaking up.
More minute in some cases because of
I lost
the
him as
averaging
well,
that's happening
John.
across.
Nate, if you wouldn't mind going back over that a little bit, you were breaking up or
Can you hear me okay?
muted. We can hear you now, but could you go back and just summarize that last point again?
Yeah, you said you can hear me okay.
Well, I thought it was okay, but we're not hearing you now.
Let me try again. I wasn't saying anything there, but can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll go off video, see if that helps a little bit here. So the point I was, and please interrupt if you're having trouble again, just interrupt so I can restart.
Great.
What I was trying to say was that for this particular scenario, the change that we're seeing is mostly, it's a very modest change because all we're working with is the amount that caps out the agencies that cap out at 30%, their funds get reallocated to the other agencies. And because we're only working with the funds that cap out from those that are receiving the maximum of 30% state operating assistance, there's a very small amount of money to work with. And the amount that varies is relatively modest. Most agencies are seeing a change of anywhere from -2% to +2%, or I should say most districts, because this is aggregating the results at the district level. But the change in funding for individual agencies is also relatively small as a result. 6 agencies are unchanged. 24 agencies would lose fund under this approach. 8 agencies would gain funds. The largest gainer is Richmond with a 2% increase and $300,000 in funding. And our characterization of this is that it's a novel approach to support that reallocation of funds that doesn't require reiteration, but it makes the formula more complex because
Hey, we've lost you again.
Year and so let me try.
We just
again.
lost you again for a little bit there.
Okay, so let me try doing something else with my audio. 1 second here. Okay. Let me try that again. You able to hear me okay now?
I think it's unclear.
All right, let me try one other thing.
Nate, maybe if you could talk a little bit more, it would help us know if you're breaking up or not.
Yeah.
We can't hear.
Okay. So let me try one other thing here real quick. All right, so we'll keep rolling here, and And what I want to talk about, let's see, did you hear the point about Richmond and how that's impacting the allocation? Did we get that far?
Repeat, please.
Okay. Yeah, so the point we were trying to make is that the amounts that the agencies are receiving by district in this particular scenario are plus or minus between 2 and -2%. And those amounts are, most are right at the middle. The amount that Richmond is getting is the largest increase as a district at about $300,000, an increase of about 2%. But most of these agencies, or districts, the amounts that are going up or down are relatively small. It's sort of at right at the noise level of what agencies get on a year-to-year basis, and therefore is something that we would characterize as adding complexity to the formula, but also not making a meaningful difference in what agencies are receiving.
Right. I think that all came through clearly.
Okay, great. So we'll keep, any questions about this one? If not, well, let me go to the fourth one. So this one caps funding growth, and there's what we did here was we said, what if we were to say that an agency basically used the existing funding amount and capped its funding at 10% growth over the prior year allocation?
Nate, you're still sharing slide 13. Need to advance to the next one.
Okay.
Yep, it's good now.
Should advance. Okay. So looking at the capped funding growth, this basically caps the growth at 10% over prior year allocations. It doesn't make any changes to the step 1 or step 2 of the allocation approach. So we're using the existing formula allocation, and we're only saying that agencies could receive no more than 10% growth in what they get in funding compared to what they got in previous years, or the previous year. And this would be a way of sort of putting a brake on agencies that are seeing fast growth in their funding or disproportionate growth relative to others across the state. At the end of the day, we didn't think that this scenario had a lot of potential, in part because there were reasons why some agencies were seeing a growth in their funding amounts that was meaningful, and in part because they may be operating more service, or there was or their performance was changing in ways that warranted more funding, and therefore we didn't think that this was a scenario that made sense, in part because it created a disconnect between the performance and the funding amounts that agencies are seeing. And you can see that, in one case, an agency, Culpeper, which had some expansion in service within that district, would see, if you were to cap out that growth, they would have a decline of 19%. This scenario really didn't make a lot of sense. So even though it was one we tested, we didn't think it made sense to advance. Any questions about those? This one?
I think we can move ahead.
Okay. So we're going to circle back. Those were the scenarios that I had to present, and I wanted to circle back to a few things related to the sizing plus performance scenario that we talked about last time. So what we're going to do is focus on, first of all, performance trend adjustment versus direct performance measurement. And this is an important concept to understand, because the existing approach is based primarily on some of the adjustments that happen in step 2 of the existing formula are based on agency trends. And trend means how am I changing from year to year in terms of my performance as an agency? And it's really about a slope of the line, as opposed to where in absolute terms an agency's performance may be. So in the left-hand side of the slide here, you see two agencies that are compared to the statewide average. Agency A actually sees a slight amount of decline in its trend from FY22 to FY24. It's the slope of that line is going down a little bit. While agency B is seeing a positive trend adjustment, it's improving from FY22 to FY24 relative to the statewide average. Its slope has a steeper slope and is not declining. But in absolute terms, agency A is performing at a higher level. In this case, we're looking at trends per riders per hour over a 4-year period. So even though agency A is really outperforming the statewide average in terms of riders per hour, it actually is penalized under the current trend adjustment because it has a downward slope, even though they're sort of, really perhaps at the frontier of what they may be able to accomplish and are performing at a really high level relative to the statewide average. A direct measurement approach, which you see on the right-hand side, would say for a given point in time, how is an agency's performance relative to the statewide average? And in this case, which is partly what we're incorporating into the step X that we're proposing as part of the performance plus the sizing plus performance scenario, is to look at where an agency is absolutely relative to the state average. So in this case, riders per hour and the factor that would help influence the funding an agency would receive is saying agency A is head and shoulders above the statewide average and should therefore get more for this particular, the amount of the allocation that's subject to this, and agency B should get less because it's below the statewide average. So just wanted to illustrate that and really note the difference between trend comparison and direct metric. And let me just pause for a second to see if there are any questions about that to make sure you're all kind of understanding the distinction between the two and how the change in formula would relate.
Do we have any questions? I see a hand up.
I do, Chair, if you don't mind.
Yep. Cindy?
I want to confirm to make sure I understand the scenario we're now analyzing here. So we are back to the DRPT consultant recommendation of, I thought I had the slide open on my screen. What slide is that? 8, sizing plus performance adjustment, where step 1, is this looking at step 1 operating cost ridership and the new breakout, and then the new step X? And so you're looking at the trend of what we're doing now versus the trend of what direct performance new step X would be.
So what we're showing here is actually not specific to any scenario as much as it is just explaining the difference between a trend adjustment and a direct performance measure. But it does relate to the scenarios that we're presenting in that the trend comparison on the left is a function of step 2 of the current formula, and the direct performance measurement on the right-hand side is what we're suggesting could be part of step X in the scenario that was presented at the last meeting.
And then if I may, Chair, thank you, Nate, for agency A and agency B, what type of agency are they? Like, what did you select? One big, large urban and one small rural, or like, how did we pick what the trend is? I assume it's not an average of types of agencies. It's a specific agency.
Yeah, the for this scenario or for this illustration, these are not specific agencies. You will find agencies of all types that might be able to fit as agency A, and those that might have service patterns that are like agency B. I don't think we could say that, you know, all the urban agencies are like A and all the paratransit only agencies are like B or anything like that. It's really meant to be illustrative of how an agency that's a high performer may not have strong trend performance because they're kind of poking along with high performance and not seeing a great trend change one way or the other.
Right, that's a little
So you're
helpful. And
basically,
sorry, John.
I was just going to say that. So you're basically showing that agency A is pretty robust in its service and maintaining that level, whereas B maybe is having the opportunity to gain more ridership and expand services, and how that produces a differential outcome for those two agencies. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
And I'm going to note that Kate has her physical hand up, but as we go for that,
Yeah, I have no
just
idea why
wanted-
mine's disabled, but I have that's clearly a lesson to my participation in the past, and I will not take it personally. I do actually. So this is
Go teams.
This is stepping back a little bit. So when we're talking about in all these scenarios, this is 5%, and so I actually have sort of a philosophical or analytical. Is the amount of work that's necessary to come up with this 5% actually providing meaningful change to the allocation of funding? Like, can this actually fundamentally change how many? If the answer is yes, that's awesome. I'm just trying to understand a lot of work for 5%.
Yeah, so I think where you can see most closely the difference here is what the allocations would be in scenario A, where all we made was the sizing adjustment, and how the funds pencil out in scenario B, where we make the trend and we make the shift from trend adjustment to performance measurement for and substitute step X for step 2. So the difference in results between the sizing plus performance scenario and scenario A would show the effective value of this shift in terms of what agencies would receive.
And just so I understand, because I'm having a hard time with A's, the slides don't say it. Is scenario A? Oh shoot, there's not slide numbers on these. I think on slides, is that slide 6? Or I'm just having a hard time figuring out when you say A, just because the slides don't mark them that way. So it's hard to, or at least I'm not finding it. Maybe I am, and I'm just not finding things. Here we go. Never mind. Sorry. I'm trying to go back through these things. So it's basically you're talking about slide 11 is the one where you would eliminate the 5%. And so if you compare those. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. It's just because we don't have the data working off the slides. The explanation is fantastic, Nate. I greatly appreciate it, but I always feel like we're just trying to catch up on this stuff. So.
Understood.
And Chair, if I could, just one follow-up question on slide 16 on the screen. It's FY21 to 24, so we're still in COVID, coming out of COVID. Would the trend analysis look different if we went back to 17 or 18?
It could. I mean, because you did see some depending on which trend you're talking about, there were some valleys that then showed some recovery. But because of those significant dips in the trends, you know, the other thing too was that the data for certain years was not factored into the merit allocation. So there were some special changes that were made because of the extreme shift in ridership and service patterns because of the pandemic, and therefore certain data was not considered for certain years. Any other questions about this one?
I've got one. Looking at the direct metric comparison, I think I understood what you were saying, but I'm going to paraphrase it and rephrase it in my terminology. I I think what you were saying is agency A is obviously performing better riders per hour than agency B in comparison to the statewide average. I know there were not any specific agencies that were pulled together to reflect, but the way that I interpret that is anyone that or any agency that's in a more urban or densely populated area is obviously going to have a leg up on beating or being ahead of the statewide average, just because there's more opportunity for riders than an agency that's in a more rural area. Am I off base in that thought process, or am I reading that correctly?
It depends on the metric that might be at play. And because sometimes you're talking about the hours and miles in relationship to the cost to operate that service, and in some cases in relation to the ridership, and the relative to the service levels that are provided. So because these are ratios and they are taking into account in many cases taking into account the fact that the cost structures may be different, the service levels may be different, and are in some ways proportional to what the ridership may be. I would say the ratios can have differences in both the numerator and the denominator that change things in terms of how it pencils out for individual agencies.
Okay.
I think both well, the questions that are being raised here are very interesting and good ones, and but also maybe part of what we would have in our general discussion as we come to the end of the slides. Are we trying to remember where we are in terms of?
I have a few more slides to present that help to illustrate a few more things with respect to the sizing plus performance scenario. So I could go through that and then maybe turn it over to the board for discussion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that probably would be helpful.
Okay. All right. So we sort of previewed a little bit of this with the last slide. Is that we're looking at, with the formula that we're looking at here, we're proposing a change from step 2 to step X, where the performance trend adjustments to size weight are basically adjusting. So agencies under the current approach, you get an amount of funding based on what your relative size is, based on the metrics that we use. And then we're adjusting that up or down based on what your trend-wise performance is relative to these 5 factors, these 5 ratios that are shown on the left. And it's an adjustment to what your sizing amount would be. Under this new approach, what we're saying is that there would be a set aside of about 5% plus whatever the remainder is that is available to be redistributed after agencies cap out at 30%. So there would be a set aside of available funding that would be distributed on this right-hand side approach using step X. So the key thing to keep in mind about this is that rather than adjusting your sizing amounts, this approach would apply to a different bucket of funds, a set aside of 5% plus the remainder after agencies cap out. So what that does is it reduces the number of metrics that's at play. It takes into account a single year of data rather than multiple years of data in making that allocation. It is easier to communicate and track performance, and it gives agencies greater ability to track the metrics to position for a higher allocation because it's a more direct measure and a more direct allocation rather than an adjustment. And it's not based on a performance trend. So it's not subject to some of the issues we saw in the previous slide where it's based on the slope of your line rather than the absolute level that your service might be at. Now, for this approach, we're setting aside 5% to make that allocation. And you can see that here that there's the available operating assistance of 95% flowing through the sizing metric and about 5% going to step X, plus some remainder after step 1 is completed and agencies cap out at a 30% cap in funding. And I think one of the questions we wanted to answer was, well, why 5%? Why make the split 95-5? Why not 90-10 or a different amount? And we wanted to show that by summarizing some of the, we did some sensitivity tests to this to determine what the appropriate allocation should be. And we looked at it at 5, 10, 15, and 20% performance set aside. And what we found was that the amounts that are set aside and the degree of the adjustment that occurs is more akin to the amount of adjustment that the existing step 2 provides to the formula at 5% rather than at 10%. And the other challenge here is that as you start to set aside more and more just to provide a performance set aside, you start to break the tie or start to introduce money that is no longer calibrated or could have a significant impact on the amount an agency might receive because there's not a sizing component to that step X. It's based solely on performance, and that's why it's a performance incentive, but it is calibrated to be small enough or large enough to be meaningful, yet small enough that it doesn't skew the allocations by giving large amounts of funds to agencies that are relatively small operations by any sort of sizing metric we might consider. So you can see here how the performance set aside changes. So the 5% performance set aside is what's in the scenario, the performance plus adjustment scenario that we presented at the last meeting. And you can see the degree of percentage change in allocation that it creates on a district basis. And you can see how it starts to skew a bit in terms of how much would some agencies stand to lose and how much some agencies or districts would stand to gain as you increase the amount of the performance set aside to the point where there are, a very large increase in funding for Richmond, as much as a 23% increase if you were to set aside as much as 20% for performance versus the 5%. That's part of the scenario that we're looking at here. I don't know if there's any questions about that.
John, it's Cindy.
Yes, Cindy, please go ahead.
Just data clarification to make sure I understand this. So looking at slide 20, which is on the screen, then I scrolled back to what was emailed out, and I think it might be slide 8 on the PDF. It doesn't have a slide. It's sizing plus performance adjustments scenario. I'm trying to match the numbers. So since I'm from Northern Virginia, I'll pick that one. The difference between current to the 5% was 1.8 rounded up. The slide on the screen says 2.8. So is the 5% still compared against the current model? And all the others also have data differences. So I'm just trying to understand the underlying assumptions.
The difference is that this is looking at 1 year's allocation, FY26, and I believe slide 10 is looking at the average.
Okay.
Over a 3-year period, FY24 through 26.
Yeah, so it's not apples to apples because of the trend analysis. there. Okay.
Yeah, or because of averaging, yeah, of results. Oh, I mean, the reason for that is we didn't run numbers for 24 and 25 for the 10, 15, and 20% scenarios. So we don't have comparable numbers for those scenarios to what we did for the 5% performance set aside.
Yes,
So
I'm
that's
just
why
trying to
everything
see if
here is
it's
in FY26
generally
numbers.
proportional, see how the average is impacting. Thanks.
Yep.
I have a question just about data presentation, because it's been throughout. Can you talk about the significance of things being marked as red or green? Because when I look at the percentages, there are some that actually are fairly substantial. I'm looking out for my friends in Fredericksburg that are not noted as red, and I'm just trying to understand why a red or a 9% or like what was it that conditional formatting rule that highlighted things as red versus highlighting things as green, or should we just ignore that?
Well, I think the conditional formatting was that if the change in dollar value is, I believe, greater than 254,000, plus or minus, it's, if it's an increase of more than 250,000, it's green. If it's a decrease of more than 250,000, it's in red. So it was entirely on a dollar and not a percentage basis.
Yeah, and I just knowing that, the percent, again, I'm sort of looking to others, that may, percent is a percent. You're in a small place. It's still a big change if you're minus 11 or minus 9. I realize this is just about data presentation, but sometimes I think it might be important moving forward that you may want to look at conditional formatting based on percent and not necessarily on dollars, is because especially for the smaller ones, that is a significant impact, even if it's less than $250,000. So just a suggestion in the way you present the information.
I agree,
Yeah.
Kate. Thank you.
Point noted. So we also want to look at what this particular scenario, the sizing plus performance adjustment scenario, how it pencils out, comparing the average allocations under, again, now in this case, we're looking at FY24 through 26 numbers. The numbers we're going to show up here are similar to the table. This information was all presented in tabular form at the last meeting. So as a way to help inform the discussion, we're showing the results by district and then also by agency in graph format so that you can see graphically how the change in funds occur. In gray, we have the allocation under the current approach and what the average annual allocation would be by district over this 3-year period. And then in blue, we've got the allocation under the sizing plus performance approach and how that would change by district. So you can see visually the change in funds by district.
And just to confirm that I'm reading correctly, it looks like this slide is the tabular slide 8 I was referring to earlier.
Yes.
Thank you. So
Yes,
it's the 3-year average.
3-year average. All right, so this is by district, and then the next 2 slides summarize the results by agency. And we broke it into 2 different slides because there's sort of a, that helps to resize the scale and to break 40 agencies up over a couple of different slides, which we're doing here. So you can see here how the lower 2 quartiles, or the agencies that are in the lower half of funding received through merit are changing. We're summarizing a few things here. Again, the gray is allocation under the current approach. Blue is allocation under this sizing plus performance approach. This is the 3-year average, FY24 through 26. And you can see the red arrows indicate where there is a decline in funding. Green indicates where there is a growth in funding. Most of these agencies are seeing a growth in funding of some in a small amount, some are as much as 12% or so in terms of the change in funding for these agencies. Just a couple that are seeing decline in funding, and a couple that don't see any change in funding. And in many cases, those are because those agencies are already receiving the maximum 30%. When we look at the upper two quartiles, so this is the upper half of agencies receiving funds through the merit allocation approach. Again, this is the 3-year average. It's graphing the same allocations as the previous slide, but because these agencies are receiving so much more money, generally speaking, the y-axis of this graph has changed. So now it's maxing out above $25 million. And you can see the change in funds by agency here. And you can see which ones are gaining funds and which ones are seeing a decline in funds with this particular scenario. We can also look at this sort of in a scatter plot fashion. So in this graph, and I know that there have been past presentations to DRPT that summarize the change in funding that agencies have received from year to year. So this is similar to the presentation that's been used with some of those updates. And in this particular graph, the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, shows in dollar terms where agencies are seeing a change in funding. And then the y-axis represents the percentage, in percentage terms, what the change in funding might be. So all the agencies are either in the lower left or the upper right quadrant because they're either gaining funds in percentage or dollar terms or losing funds in percentage or dollar terms. We see a good bit of clustering right around the y-axis because the percentage change for most agencies is relatively modest, and therefore actually, let me say the dollar change for most agencies, the clustering around the y-axis is because the dollar change for most agencies is relatively modest. And you can see a lot of agencies are really mostly right along that vertical line. And then some of the agencies that we've talked about previously are seeing some more significant changes in funding in dollar and percentage terms than others. So several that stand out here are Fairfax Connector, PRTC, and FXB Go. And then you can see the agencies that stand to gain in percentage in dollar terms to the upper right, including GRTC Richmond, HRT ART, Valley Metro in Roanoke, GLTC in Lynchburg, and City of Radford. So hopefully this graph, regardless of our conditional formatting in the other table, hopefully this graph helps to illustrate the changes in both dollar and percentage terms so that it provides some additional context here that can be useful.
Greatly appreciated.
So a few key findings here that I want to highlight. This is a little bit of a review from the last TSDAC meeting in July. This particular approach, the scenario that we presented last time and went into more detail about again this time, simplifies the formula by removing the trend adjustment, which makes it easier to communicate the formula to the public and to operators and to decision makers. It makes the formula more outcome focused and performance oriented by preserving the performance factors that are part of the sizing calculation today, but changing the proportion of them to make them more focused on outcomes rather than inputs. It still accounts for disparity in agency size by considering cost. So cost remained part of the formula. And as we've discussed, that has an important impact on allocations to address the types of services that are operated across the state and the geographic area and the population densities these agencies serve, and the regional cost variation, the regional difference in cost to operate service across the state. It shifts the allocations mainly from removal of the trend adjustment. So there were trends that favored larger urban areas in the last 2 years due to strong recovery from the slowdown of COVID. And when some of those trend adjustments are removed, it can affect what agencies are receiving and funding. We are noting that in absolute terms, agencies are starting to see a recovery of their ridership, especially in areas that are seeing a strong federal return to office. And that's something to think about as well in terms of how that could impact the absolute performance for agencies in FY27, because they will have more higher ridership, which if you're increasing the extent to which ridership is part of the formula, that could impact how much agencies are receiving here. And then we see a small shift away from large urban to small urban agencies. So reductions in Fairfax County, Jaunt, and PRTC, and increases for HRT, Lynchburg, Arlington, GRTC, and Valley Metro. We also wanted to tee up how these scenarios, so we've got the sizing plus performance scenario is on the right here, and you can see that that addresses 3 of the goals of this study, where the other 4 scenarios that we presented each addressed 1 goal of the study, but not more than 1. And that's part of the reason why the sizing plus performance scenario became the focus of the approach here. I also want to remind everyone that there are some approaches and limitations to the current data, alternative approaches that could be considered, but we would need better consistent data from agency to agency to potentially support allocations in the future based on these approaches. So you could do a tiered allocation by mode, but you'd need a standard methodology to account for the administrative and overhead costs by mode for the different modes that are operated across the state, and an approach to partitioning revenues into tiers. We also need to do tiered allocations you could do tiered allocations by transit agency type, such as large urban or small urban and rural, but you'd need standardized procedures for those reporting metrics, because not everybody reports to NTD, National Transit Database, and the state would need to collect the data to support this. Also need to account for the fact that agencies provide multiple types of service and potentially partition revenues into tiers, as you would have to do if you tiered by mode. You could think about allocating based on passenger miles traveled, but would need the data to collect that. And right now, the data for PMT is relatively loose data that might be would not be an acceptable basis for doing funding allocations because of the inconsistency of that data from agency to agency. You could also consider locally derived income. How much are agencies collecting from fare revenues or ancillary revenues or student passes or even local contributions to transit, and take that into account in terms of incentivizing agencies that are putting more of their local funds from different sources into transit. You could also take into account the cost of living, but you need an approach to isolate agencies by their service areas and determine how to measure the cost of living for different metro areas across the state. And there's some data that might be available out there on that, but it would take further investigation to figure out how do you make this work for every agency, given that the information is not necessarily consistent, or that not every agency is in a metro area where cost of living data is reported. So how do you handle that for those agencies? So these are all potential data that could be collected in the future and could point the way to new allocations that could be part of a future round of considerations by TSDAC, but we really need the data first before this could be something that could be on the table for further consideration by everyone. So I think that's our last slide on the capital assistance. I'm going to pause there, and I think there's probably some questions for us before we move to discussion. It looks like Ms. Matthijs, do you have a question?
I do, and actually you just talked about data. And so one of the things that TSDAC and I think the transit systems in the Commonwealth have had the benefit of is the backup data for this. Even back, whether it be in the McDonald, McAuliffe, or even any of those 3 administrations, we were always shared the backup information when TSDAC met or when there was this reallocation. And so what I really ask is the ability to get that type of information that we've been able to get every time that TSDAC's gone through, or the Merit or its predecessors have gone through changes. So that's just a request, because I think this is obviously phenomenal analytical work. But some of us, especially those of us who have a lot of different systems, we need to really sort of understand and has some time to play in the data. So that is really a formal request that the information be shared just like it has in previous administrations, because I think that's going to help answer a lot of our questions. Thanks.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
appreciate that. I don't know if Director Robinson, if you want to address that.
Sure. Thank you, Nate. And Kate, thank you so much for asking that. We actually already talked about this. We really wanted to get through, since the members of TSDAC had so many questions in the last meeting and in the 3 meetings leading up to this one, we wanted to make sure we were working with our consultant to provide the data publicly as this TSDAC process moved forward. But we totally agree with you. And after this meeting, we will be posting the background data so that the members of TSDAC and everyone has access to it along with the slides. The difficulty, and I will say this kind of proactively, is we all know this formula is very complex. The data is very complex. We welcome opportunities for follow-up meetings or for one-on-ones. We want to make sure that everyone who looks at the data receives it with the context that our consultants have worked so hard to pull together and plug it into slides and scenarios. So that being said, we want everybody to have access to the data, but we look forward to any follow-up questions you may have or any agency may have so that we can answer it with context and the consultants and our staff can share exactly how we used the data to come up with these scenarios. Does that make sense?
I greatly appreciate that because, again, I think a lot of the questions that folks have are a lot of the trends in transit, especially in Northern Virginia, have fundamentally changed in the last year. And so, you know, how that plays out in this formula, if you look at new data versus old data, I think that's kind of thing we want to get our fingers dirty in. But I greatly appreciate all the work you guys have done.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this point? Comments?
I don't have questions. I do have comments, but I'll hold that to the open discussion part.
Okay, thank you.
I do have one question, Chair, on the operating before we move on. Going back to like slide 23, 24, you're presenting these allocations over a 3-year average. And the question that I have, and it may be something that is fleshed out in the data that's presented later or provided later publicly, how much volatility is happening year over year? Because I'll look at like the town of Alta Vista is a 10% increase, but that's an average over 3 years. What type of volatility is happening year over year in general to get to these percentage increase and decreases over that average?
Yeah, well, in terms of the existing program, the existing approach, some of the information that we laid out, the right slide here in this slide summarizes what we're seeing in year over year. And this is based on your current allocation approach. This is how it's bouncing around at present. So by district on the left and for individual agencies graph on the right. So there is some noise, so to speak, in terms of how much variation agencies are seeing in funding year over year, absent any changes in formula over the last 3 years, just based on how the data has shifted year to year, as well as how the total amount of funding, available has some impact on this as well. And the noise level that we're seeing here with the existing allocations or the previous year's actual allocations is similar to the variation we would likely see under the revised approach, that variation is likely to continue to some extent at that same kind of noise level from year to year.
John, if I may share a thought, as I have listened to members of the CTB talk about this, one of the things that they seemed focused on is assuring that the limited dollars we have for mass transit are being spent to meet the greatest needs. And the more I have thought about this, it seems to me that it's really not possible to put in a need factor, but rather we take the view, which I think a necessity we must take, is that each person who participates in mass transit has equal need. Now, individually, I suspect we would all acknowledge that someone who needs it to go to the dialysis treatment is probably a greater need than someone, and there are not many of these, who are just out riding around town for entertainment purposes. But it seems to me there's really no way to inject individual need, response to needs, into the metrics for the system. Does everybody generally agree with that, or am I missing something?
Yeah, I think that that you make a good point, Dr. Smoot. I think one of the questions that leads to is the suggestion earlier on that, considering the possibility of variation by modes of transit that we're talking about is something you'd be interested, or other CTB members would be interested in looking at.
Yes, but I don't know to what extent we have that kind of data. The other thing, which, I hear, and the more I think about it, the less excited I get about it, is, people will see a nearly empty bus driving by, or van or something, and say, well, clearly that's not meeting much of a need. Well, it seems to me that's not necessarily so, because we have vehicles that are moving to position themselves to meet needs that may have even no passengers on them. Most people do not, as they get a quick visualization of that, they do not look to see whether it says out of service or not. So it's really anecdotal that I think is creating in the minds of some people that mass transit is not very efficient because they see all these empty seats. But I don't know any way to meet needs without having seats that are sometimes empty.
Mm-hmm. Again, I think that's one of the challenges that we've been facing here, and why we have some consideration for deadheading vehicles back to their location. I think that's obviously clear, and it really emphasizes again. And I don't want to speak to Zach and the Director Robinson's roles specifically. I don't want to impose on that, but it's up to us all to tell that story. How many individuals utilize the services, and how that would impact congestion and so forth if transit was not supported. Which again leads us to the notion that here we are just sort of rearranging the deck chairs, as opposed to talking about addressing need for a service that increasingly is regarded as necessary or desirable by more and more people.
Yes.
Other comments, other questions?
This is Jamie. After Cindy, I have some comments.
Okay. Cindy, did you have anything else at this point?
I do. I guess process wise, do you want to do it during open discussion or tie it to operating and then we do capital?
If Jamie, you got some questions about what we've done or some comments on what we've gone through so far, maybe we'll do that, and then we'll move on and look at the capital side, and then have opportunities for open discussion.
Sure. I just had some quick comments. I do believe that Kate was right on the money when she asked a couple of questions, one of which is, are we really moving the needle with this reallocation? Or as Dr. McGlennon just said, are we just rearranging deck chairs? So I'm not really sure or convinced this is the methodology change or it's necessary or needed at this time. I think it's good information and I think it's a good presentation, but we had asked for data before and I definitely respect Director Robinson's comments about waiting to get the information, but we really need that data because answering the question, which I don't believe it was adequately answered, and I'm not asking you to re-answer it because I think you gave the best answer you could. On the presentation, when Kate asked about, you know, what makes the winners and losers of certain areas, and we can see that Northern Virginia area, Fredericksburg, so count that as Northern Virginia, definitely have some characteristics about that demographic in that area that are actually making their allocations go down significantly. And it's millions of dollars for Northern Virginia, and it's a high percentage for Fredericksburg. So we really need at some point that question to be answered, because if we're going to a merit-based system or changing the merit-based system to something different, we really have to understand, those agencies have to understand why there are changes or what they can do to change to make their numbers improve. I'll also just say really quickly, I'm not sure that moving away from a trend is the answer right now. And the reason being, I think it's counterproductive to some of the other programs that DRPT has implemented, specifically the Fair Free program, because if agencies, which will occur next year for most agencies that started the Fair Free program, if they go back to charging fares because their jurisdictions require it, they won't be helped as far as ridership. And that may be an even more significant drop in their funding levels as well. So I just wanted to put that out there, because agencies that go back to a fair model from the Fair Free model may be negatively impacted if it just goes to a year data as opposed to the 3-year trend. So those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, if there are no other comments, reserving Cindy's points for the more general discussion, why don't we move on to the capital side?
Okay, and we've got Sarah from Kimley here to discuss that.
Thanks, Nate. Hi, I'm Sarah Shrino from Kinley Horn, and we're going to go through a couple of quick slides on capital. Appreciated the discussion last time, and so these slides are intended to answer some questions from the last TSDAC meeting, specifically around some data requests. And so we won't go through everything in detail from previous, but we will touch base on the couple of questions. Providing some context, this is what we talked about last time. This is the existing formula. There are 3 categories: data repair, minor enhancement, and major expansion. And at the last meeting, we talked about some of the nuances of how projects are categorized and a recommendation to shift into multiple subcategories for our state of good repair and major expansion. Those were driven by the fact that state of good repair has some projects that we know the service life of and other projects that we don't. And so those projects that we don't have a service life for get scored under minor enhancement, and therefore are kind of grouped together with minor enhancement. And we felt a need to pull those projects out because they are truly state of good repair projects. On the major expansion side, those are projects that are greater than 3 million. And we found that there is a lot of several projects that are greater than 3 million, but are truly more of a state of good repair project. And so because of that, those are different than actually expanding or adding service, but are getting scored under the same methodology. And so the proposed approach, Nate, if you can go to the next slide, breaks out that state of good repair into 2 different subcategories. State of good repair with an asset condition score and without an asset condition score. On the major side, we'd have major expansions. Those are those projects that are adding, expanding, they're adding service versus the major state of good repair projects that are really just in, making those repairs to those elements that already exist today. And so on the left side, that we're really formalizing an existing DRPT process, but we're breaking out those projects separately so that we know which ones are truly state of good repair versus the minor enhancements. On the major side, that does require a policy change for how those projects are scored. So what we want to do to share extra information with this group on the next slide is to show you what we're talking about in terms of number of projects. So the table at the top shows for the last 3 fiscal years, FY24 to 26, the projects that are bucketed and scored under state of good repair, minor enhancement, and major enhancement. You're seeing that the bulk of the projects that come into the merit program are state of good repair projects. The table at the bottom then shows under the proposed new methodology and the subcategories, we would break those out into those 5 new categories. So your projects that were state of good repair are going to continue to be scored as state of repair. That minor category that included projects that did not have an asset condition score is now getting broken out into state of good repair projects without an asset condition score and minor enhancements. So you're seeing that those 236 projects that were grouped with the minor enhancement projects under the existing process, but our truly state of good repair process will get broken out in this new subcategory. On the major side of things, DRPT does not receive a lot of major applications each year, as you can see. And so it would be breaking out the handful of projects and scoring them differently for those major state of good repair. I also want to pause on this slide because I think it's important to note that we do have, when we start to compare merit versus smart scale, smart scale is really focused on the projects that overlap between the two are really just those major expansion projects. So the merit program is looking at a lot more of those state of good repair projects that aren't smart scale projects. Any questions on the subcategories? Okay, the other thing that we talked about at the previous meeting was incentive scoring. And so under the current methodology, projects can receive up to 10 incentive points under the state of good repair and the minor enhancement program. And those existing categories are zero emission technology, innovation, safety and comfort, and then agency accountability. And we discussed last time that zero emissions and safety and comfort were really underutilized incentive points, and innovation was maybe not capturing the projects that we thought were truly innovative. And we did see that there was a really strong correlation between and trend line between agency accountability year over year. And more agencies were getting those agency accountability points when we compared FY24 to 25 to 26. Based on that, the suggestion would be to revise the incentive scoring to have 5 categories of really agency accountability points. 3 of them would be the existing metrics, Trans Am updates, TDP, TSP updates, and performance reporting, and then adding 2 additional agency accountability good grants management categories. Those are project progress. So this is incentivizing agencies to show that progress is getting made on funded projects. So you would get points under this category as long as your agency did not have projects that had received funding 2 years ago and had no invoices against them. And then project closeout, this is incentivizing agencies to close out projects in a timely manner. So as long as you had no projects with that were more than 90 days expired, you would get project closeout points. And so under the proposed methodology, you get up to 2 points for each of these 5 categories. So the total amount, the 10 points available would remain the same, but the factors would be a little different. And so we took a look at what would that mean in terms of actual incentive scores between the current methodology and the proposed methodology. And on the next slide, we see that so in FY26, in the existing incentive scoring, so the four original categories, projects that were state of good repair projects on average got about 5 points of incentive and 5.5 points for projects in the min. When we applied the new proposed incentive scoring, projects generally got more points. State of good repair projects got up to, got an average of 7 points. Min got an average of 6 points. So we saw that there really wasn't a huge differential in amount of incentive points being awarded on average, change of about 1.9 points for the state of good repair projects and 0.5 points for the min projects. But there was a range. You could get up to, you could lose up to 8 points or gain up to 8 points based on these criteria. When we looked at projects being funded or not funded, what we found was only a handful of projects right at that funding threshold line were impacted by the incentive points. So in general, it wasn't swinging the pendulum one way or the other. It was really just impacting that handful of projects that were right around the threshold for being funded or not being funded. Yes.
Sarah, I have a question. It's only because I'm a little bit slow on the uptake. Can you, just going back to slide 32, the new subcategories.
Yep.
Can you give an example of what is a state of good repair project that would not have an asset condition, and then how that would be evaluated? I'm literally just trying to get my brain around that.
Yeah, and I may, Dan, could you give an example of one that doesn't have a,
like what state of good repair would not have an asset condition? Just because I can't imagine what that would look like. So
Sure. And to that point, all state of good repair projects would have an asset condition, but we can't give it an asset condition score with the current methodology, because to do that, we need a in-service dates and a state accepted estimated service life to calculate it. And so we simply don't have that data for all asset categories. And so what we do is we shift it over to the more qualitative minor enhancement category for scoring.
One example.
Oh yes, example.
And like HVAC or yeah, some IT, yeah, some, yeah.
Yeah, a good example would be maintenance equipment.
Okay.
Yeah, there's lots of things that make it onto this list.
No, that's helpful. I just was literally just trying to get my brain around what that was.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's things that are actually not sort of the FTA rolling stock
Right.
type of, okay. It's things that you still need to use to run your system, but they're not maybe stereotypical transit assets.
Yeah, and simply the things that we do not have that state accepted estimated service life, so we can compare everybody across the board.
Okay.
Cindy, I think you've got a question.
Thank you. And it's slide 32 and tied to the incentive points. So it looks like the change doesn't dramatically change on the incentives, who gets funded, because it's just right around where we run out of money. Does the change to the subcategories just help clarify the process and procedures and document practice, or would it change any of the funding? Because the application count still comes out the same, but like now there's more in STR. Does it change?
Yeah, certainly, and I'll answer that one, Sarah. To your point, yes, it clarifies process. It makes the process more transparent, and it addresses some of the things that we already have to kind of do in the background, but just lays that out a little more clear in our policies.
So no funding change for what would get funded or not based on how much money we have.
That's correct.
Generally.
For at least for the SGR and minor enhancement, the major expansion one, it does change the scoring for how we approach those project scores. But it essentially also aims to prioritize major construction projects that are satisfying a state of good repair need.
Thank you for clarifying and for the transparency for all on this call.
Problem.
And for the I think it was the next slide or maybe two over, where you had the five, yes, that was with the five incentive.
Back one more, Nate, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm trying to understand a little bit better about these good grants management as they relate to major expansion. Is that
they would not apply to major expansion? So these incentive points under the existing are just minor enhancement and state of good repair.
Just minor enhancement.
Correct.
Okay. So and in those instances, you're going to look back and see at the requests just to determine whether past experience has been successful or not. And
yeah, so it would be on an agency by agency basis. And so we would look at for each agency, does that agency have any grant funding that they received and that was more than 2 years old and where no claims or invoices have been made against it for the project progress. So making sure that funds that are being given out are being used. And then project closeout, similarly, it would be on an agency basis and checking that agencies don't have any projects that are more than 90 days expired.
Okay. And is there a way of determining the degree to which these are the result of agency slowness or inability to get things done versus supplier challenges?
Yeah, and
so
Grant, I know we had some discussion around the vehicle procurements when we were developing these.
Yeah, I think for the project progress one, that's if we move forward with these recommendations, we'll definitely need to, factor those like one-off circumstances into our policy and process, because there are, to your point, there are reasons outside of the agency's control as to why they haven't been able to submit any claims or invoices against the project. The vehicle example is a good one. Sometimes vehicles take a very long time to be built and delivered, and thus the invoice from the OEM won't come to the transit agency until it's actually delivered. And so, yeah, those are things that we're going to have to factor in somehow. Maybe we exclude vehicles or certain types of projects from that analysis. But ultimately, what we're trying to do with this is to just show that or give extra points to agencies that are making good progress on their grants that they have.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question about the major category. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, because under the current merit capital, it's listed as major expansion, which included adding, expanding, improving service and facilities with a project cost of $3 million or more, and then expansion vehicles of more than 5 vehicles or 5% of the fleet. Is the intent of shifting to the major expansion and major SGR to focus more on like large facility projects? Because I seem to recall from the last meeting that the vehicle component was removed from that, but I'm not seeing it in this presentation.
Yeah, this presentation, we are just going through some of the questions. And to your point, yes, the vehicle, combining all vehicles into minor enhancement is still a proposed recommendation to move forward with. And so for the major expansion, it really is the what we see for the state of good repair projects is primarily those facility replacements.
Okay, and because that was going to be my next question. The 4 that got broken out over
Yep.
the last 3 years were facility type construction. Okay, thank you.
If I could just note here, Sarah, there are no SGR replacement vehicles in the major program. Those all go into the major expansion, or the SGR side of the scoring, where there's no limits on how many replacement vehicles a agency can apply for in a given year.
True. The expansion vehicles are the ones that there was the distinction for, and those are now getting moved to minor enhancement.
Any other comments or questions at this point? Hearing none.
Okay, and then the other part that there was some discussion around some questions that were sent out to agencies, and I am going to turn this over to Zach and his team to talk through.
Hey, Sarah, thanks. Yeah, just real quickly, we had sent out as you see, the 2 questions in a quick survey, and we actually had excellent participation with 32 respondents, so a high percentage. For the first question, actually, there were only 11 that were a no, which obviously means that there were a majority that were a yes or no opinion. I might say that's a little misleading, perhaps, because even those that were supportive had some concerns, but agencies that were not supportive, basically it's centered around the timing of external budget and financial processes, both local and federal, when it came to the timing of the grant cycle. And so they're just in a little different flavors of getting local support and getting some federal numbers. So yeah, it was people who are flexible and generally willing to go along, but there were certainly some concerns there that we understand and could kind of see coming. On question number 2, again, the yes and no opinion were actually in a large majority with about 31 of them, but they really weren't many specific reasons for being supportive. The no really stressed that not having applications every year could cause a loss of momentum potentially with funding partners, and cause some of that support to perhaps evaporate. So overall, these were broad questions, obviously, and so we're appreciative of the participation and feedback from so many agencies. That gives us a little more context in the advantages and disadvantages to these approaches that we're thinking about. So if you all recall, these were brought forward because we do experience somewhat of a compressed time period for reviewing applications. But this feedback even already has us thinking about ways that we can perhaps address that without causing too much upheaval. So what was stressed in the survey as well, that things be communicated. So we pledge for that to be the case as we consider these things. But broad questions, we appreciate the feedback, but it was some valuable feedback. So thank you.
Cindy.
Thanks, Chair. Zach, if I could, just a couple of clarifications to make sure I understood the feedback. So starting with question 2, there was general support for some concern just for timing of leveraging outside resources. But for a lot of the major projects, don't we have a multi-year commitment? So you wouldn't be applying every year for a phased large project. Am I recalling correctly?
That's true. Yes, we do have some multi-year projects, and so that's something that's kind of been evolving over time. Yeah, as we get some of those in.
So that just may be communicating and understanding the process if there was a change there. Right. For the question number 1, the reason that one kind of appealed to me is I just know at the local level, we do a 5-year kind of budget and look ahead, operating and capital, and also tying it to some of our other fundings, whether it's BDOT, MBTA, or MBTC. We're not doing annual, we're kind of looking ahead.
Uh-huh.
So I'm wondering if that is, like you said, feedback that's useful for you all, or maybe it just needs to be fleshed out more so that you could consider the interplay.
Yeah, so you all, what you're saying is you're supportive of that. Maybe you could support moving the cycle because you all looking out further. But some that may not be doing that, yeah, they may not be as supportive. So yeah, there's just some inconsistencies there. But that was the biggest concern, was yeah, just having those conversations around local budget, but budget amounts, whether they have happened soon enough for them to really be prepared to move it up. Yeah, and some may be better prepared than others. Yeah, as you're kind of saying. Yeah. So
Thank you for the additional context. It just may need, these would have to be fleshed out more, and especially if there's any other change, don't do too much at once.
Yes, but valuable feedback to know what the concerns were. And as you said, some of them, like, your localities have a little different process maybe. But yeah, seeing where everybody's at this point to get deeper into that. Thank you.
So Zach, should we move to a biennial application cycle? And based on current appropriation levels, which may not be the case in the future, but anyway, whatever they are, how much money in round numbers would we have available for the major construction projects on a biennial basis?
So there's somebody remind me, there's only 20% of the capital allocation can even be made for that. It doesn't have to be. It's limited to that. So Dan, what's that number off the top of our heads? It's 16 million a year, I think, can be devoted to these major expansion projects.
Yeah, that's about right. Since we get about 86 to 90 million in the program, that makes sense.
But again, that doesn't have to be devoted to it. It just
so in round numbers, it would be right now it would be about 30 million a year. I mean, a biennial.
Yes, that could be set aside for that, but that would mean it'd be taken off of, in consideration for other projects, because it's not set aside for that specifically. But you're correct. Yeah, the most they basically could be that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments at this point before we go into general discussion? Anything else? Sarah, do you have anything else on here? I think my recollection is
just next
we move
steps,
on to next steps.
Correct.
Yeah. And do we want to do that after the discussion, or you want to present that now?
I'm going to defer to Tiffany and Zach on that.
I think let's go ahead and open it up to discussion, and then we can end with our timeline to make sure everyone understands that as we talk about it before we move to public comment.
Great, thank you. Okay. So, a lot to digest, a lot of responses to questions that were raised last time around, some points that obviously are on people's minds right now. So anybody like to kick us off?
I'm glad to, John, if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great, Cindy.
All right, so it is a lot to digest and think about, and I appreciate the follow-up to the questions we had from the last meeting and all the appendixes at the back end of the slide deck, although I will have to say that plus Jamie and Kate's earlier comments about additional data, I still look for it, and it's taking more time to absorb it. Representing VML and VACO, I always have the local government hat on. And so I am thinking about how do these changes impact localities. We're still coming out of COVID, and now we have a new federal impact, and it is a statewide impact. It's not just Northern Virginia. But that it does raise in my mind the impact to some of these changes that we're doing. I can't do it in isolation, so I just wanted to make that comment. More specifically, and my slides just went away. I switched to the agenda for a moment. Okay. I am a bit concerned about process. When I look back at what we did starting back in 2013 and through COVID and changes, we had more time to analyze and we had the data. And so I kind of want to comment in a question which will tie back to next steps, but is TSDAC going to have another meeting after we digest this information? Are we being asked to take a vote today? I don't see anything on the agenda for making a recommendation. And if we are, I am concerned because I don't feel like I have digested all of that and all the input I would need from VML members. I did ask to Zach and Tiffany this morning, and I realized it was last minute because I've been on leave, sort of to have a refresher of the chronology of how we've done changes in the past. And not everything was on the website, and I was trying to go through some of my notes, but I would find it very helpful to know, when did we first adopt? When was the third year and we made changes? When did we review, but we didn't make changes because we were monitoring revenue, or the Revenue Advisory Board was happening, or COVID. And so I had that request in, and that would help me understand sort of where we are in this process. And then specifically on some content pieces on the overall capital changes, I don't have any major concerns with that because, as Dan helped clarify, it is documenting current practice or improving process and being more transparent. I am still struggling with the operating changes. And so the additional data and analysis was helpful today. But when I look at slide 20, which was the different performance percentages, 5, 10, 15, and 20, assuming my assumption is correct, this is using the new models, so the ridership and operating changes, those percentages. I don't see a lot of difference between 5 and 10%, so I'm trying to analyze in my mind why we wouldn't do 10%, for example, when the goals that were articulated as part of the study for this effort is outcome measurements and performance. You know, if I was just looking at a program coming to city council, 5%, sort of to Kate's earlier question, is it really changing stuff? 5% wouldn't look like it was performance oriented or outcome measures, because the other looks more like sizing and operating. So I'm still struggling in my mind, what's the right percentage based on the DRPT recommended formula for us to look at today. And then final comment, Chair, I do appreciate the additional look at the 4 other scenarios, sort of the runners up, because it was helpful to have that context as to what came forward as a recommendation. Seeing the data will help me confirm, but certainly changing the sizing only didn't seem to have a good outcome, for example. So a few thoughts. Basically, I would be interested in knowing the next steps and what TSDAC's role in this process and the timing, and then more time to really analyze my thoughts as a TSDAC member for the operating changes.
Recognizing it would possibly take a little bit of time to pull together the past history. Is there any reaction from Director Robinson or from Zach?
Sure, I'll jump in. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Cindy, and Zach, please jump in if I miss anything or if you have additional information, or if I get anything wrong, please feel free to jump in and correct me. Cindy, you raised a lot of questions, and I think to yours and the chair's comment about a timeline, I do think actually we have that, primarily because I asked for it, I think in the very beginning of this process, to help myself understand where we have come from. So I will look for that, and we will share with this group following this meeting as soon as we find it or pull it together for you. I agree with you that that is helpful to know what's happened to date. To your question about voting, I'm going to look into that too. You may be able to share with me more about the process that happened initially previously. I know it was longer. I know you were working from scratch and getting ready to present legislation. This is a little bit different. We're in a required statutory review of the methodology, and we're trying to improve and make tweaks. Although these tweaks seem very, very complex, it is because we're starting with a complex formula. I know that in accordance with statute, we are to consult with this TSDAC and work with you through this process. I hadn't thought about requiring a vote. I would like to hear more about that from this group. And of course, we look to working with you going forward. Future meetings are still to be determined. There is obviously in our timeline that we shared in every single meeting going forward, more requirements in this process should we decide to move forward with the recommendation. On the operating, the capital policy recommendations we can do internally and would present to CTB, but anything relating to operating requires a 45-day public comment period. So should we decide, working with you and having all of our follow-up meetings with stakeholders and doing more of a deep dive to ensure everybody has the data and all questions have been answered, should we decide to move forward with a formal public comment process, we would obviously broadcast that widely so that everybody could weigh in. And it would be after that that we would make a determination as to whether we were going to present a recommendation to CTB. So we'll show when we're done with this conversation a slide that kind of lays out the timeline that we've been showing since day one. Let's see, I'm trying to remember all of your other questions. You mentioned the sizing, and I did want to address that, and my team may want to jump in. We obviously ran scenarios and initially agreed that it would make sense to shift kind of the 95-5. We're trying to, we talk about this being we're really proud of this being a performance-based system, but it seems to be, when you look at the methodology closely, a small percentage. So we wanted to increase that. However, that had a much bigger impact. So instead, what we did was change the weights in the sizing, which is a much bigger portion, to make the sizing more performance-based. We reduced the total operating cost weight of the sizing factor and increased the performance percentages there. So in essence, we increased performance on both sides, even though they're still 95-5. And that was partially due to all the scenarios being run and trying not to, make too much change as we're trying to make improvements in a phased approach. I'm not sure if I answered all your questions, but I'm happy to take more or shoot them to my staff.
You did a great job, and I appreciate it. I'm going to start with the last first. I think maybe it's a messaging then, because you're right. When I look at how you change the step one, it does pick up more on ridership. So you pick up the performance, but when you just see the 5% and this slide 20 doesn't remind us of step one, it may be part of that factor, because a 95-5 split doesn't come across as performance heavy. And to your other piece, I appreciate that you have the chronology and the history. I did go back and did a fun memory test. I didn't have everything downloaded because I was relying on the website, and since the website didn't go all the way back, but I did look at my notes, and with the working group in TSDAC early on in 2013 and 14, we had a total of 7 meetings. That was indeed a heavier lift to start from scratch and decide on the data, the analysis, and the proxies. But even then, in 2016, we had 3 meetings in the fall. There was some earlier preliminary stuff before a recommendation went to CTB. Then we kind of went into a 2-meeting cycle, it seems, if I captured my notes right from minutes and agendas. And those are more when we were looking at COVID and monitoring and not making a substantial change. And then, of course, right now we're picking up. And I do appreciate that since April, we've had 2 meetings, but I feel like at least one more, and I'm not sure I'm totally there yet, like we said. And then the last thing I will note from my memory, we have always had a recommendation from TSDAC go to CTB. It's either been a consensus majority vote, or early on, we actually had 2 TSDAC members have a minority report go to the CTB. And I recall that because I was one of the minority authors at that time. I do think it's pretty important that as a state code mandated advisory board that we actually advise the CTB as well as the DRPT. And I think we've all taken it very seriously that we're partners with you in analyzing it. And that's why you get all these questions from us. And I appreciate the response because I do see it collaborative partnership. But as this TSDAC member, I feel pretty strongly we need to have a recommendation on the record. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Director.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thanks very much. And I think it's certainly the case that we have typically had a recommendation, obviously recognizing that CTB will either accept that recommendation or have its own view on exactly what should be done or some combination there. But yeah, I think that it only makes sense to have the assembled parties here have the opportunity to express an opinion about the potential change or continuation. Other comments or thoughts as we're going forward? What?
I get John, just to add, and
Yeah,
again,
Kate.
I'm really, part of it is I'm really anticipating what we'll see with next steps. Again, greatly appreciate pulling this off. I know, and really this is amplifying something that Cindy just said. Each of us sitting here are representing an organization. And so I know that Noelle and I are here representing VTA, and our ability to hear from the members of VTA is really important. The challenge of doing a lot of this stuff during the summer, and I can even speak to my own space, is I can't do anything without my board giving me approval. And we've had 2 really, really thoughtful meetings, and I know we're going to get some more data, have literally been in a space where I have not had a board meeting. So my authority to say things, and that may be the case with others, is very limited in the summertime. And so I do look forward to getting the information, going out, talking to the members of VTA, and so that they either individually or through Noelle and I can come and speak better about this moving forward. So the presentations have been incredibly helpful. Knowing your commitment, Tiffany, to provide the data is just fantastic, because I think that's really going to help. And so I do look forward to the ability to come back in a meaningful way, representing some thoughtful analytical work, and adding that to the dialogue this fall, especially once all of us have the ability to get some sort of authorization from our boards to be providing comments in a public space. So thank you.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, I would like to echo the thoughts of Cindy and Kate, representing VTA and representing other organizations. I think it's critically important that we have the time necessary to go back and meet with them and get their input as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Noelle. Anyone else? Dr. Smoot, do you have any comments you'd like to make about the CTB and
Thank you very much.
expectations?
No discussion.
Okay, well, if that's any other comments before we move along here, I guess the next point would be to look at the timeline and next steps, and then to have the public comment. I think I may have moved that around a little bit. Would you rather start with the public comment?
Mr. Chair,
Not sure.
Yeah, I'm fine with talking about, I thought we had a slide with the timeline of next steps, but maybe that was in a previous presentation that we presented. I just wanted to follow up on the last comments regarding these next steps, because we already talked about that we would need to determine follow-up meetings. We for Kate and Noel's benefit, we do already have a request from VTA for a follow-up meeting to do a little bit of a deep dive in the numbers, which we have agreed to. We want to make time to meet with any agency that would like more information or like us to, as I said earlier, give some context to the numbers. Not everyone can look at these spreadsheets and initially grasp. I need my team to explain it to me 3 times sometimes. So we want to provide that kind of technical assistance and answer all questions at the TSDAC level, but as you have requested, with any stakeholder that wants more information. So that's part of our next steps. And again, as I mentioned earlier, should we decide after collecting feedback and after consulting with you that we want to move forward with a public comment, we would do that for 45 days and broadcast that widely. Thank you for that slide that we've showed in the past. And then we would be taking a recommendation potentially to CTB. So that is kind of the timeline we've talked about from day one, should we get to a point where we have recommendations to propose. And as I mentioned earlier, the code requires us to review the operating side of this formula. But my understanding is every 3 years when this methodology has been reviewed, the department has really looked at the methodology comprehensively and always included capital as well. So either way, even though we wouldn't necessarily need as the formal level of approvals for capital policy changes, we would be presenting those the same way and taking that recommendation to CTB as well. So does anybody have questions about the kind of the timeline or the next steps of the process of how this would play out? Yeah, Cindy?
Don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I appreciate this slide being back up, and that was what raised the question for me, because I don't see a TSDAC recommendation slot in there, and so I would ask that which I sense we hear consensus from the TSDAC members and chair, I'll let you confirm. I would like to see a time where we come back together to have that recommendation, which yes means another meeting, and which means would have to be in September to meet that October 15th or early October deadline. But I also do want to say thank you for going out and meeting with our operators and transit advocacy groups, and I'll work with Mitchell Smiley from VML to see if we need to do an invitation to have to be before the VML conference though, because that'll be too tight for your window because they are concurrent. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, and VACO, of course, has its annual meeting in November, so it would come too late for this. But I will talk with the folks involved in the transportation committee, the policy committee for VACO. And I do just want to also make a comment that I think everybody understands and agrees with, but I just think it's important to state that all of us involved in this process have the same goal in mind, and that is to have an effective and efficient utilization of the resources available to help maintain and expand opportunities for transit, for public access to transportation. Obviously, I think it's not a role that we have officially, formally, or legally, but our advocacy for a robust amount of funding for public transportation, I think, is something that we can never lose sight of. We are dealing with moving around a relatively small amount of funding, and that makes it frustrating and important because those limited dollars have to go a long way. But I appreciate the motivation and commitment of everybody involved in this process. I'll just stop with that. Any other comments before we move on to public comment beyond the TSDAC members?
Chair, I just wanted to say well said, and a good way to remind us why we're all here and willing to do the work.
For years and years and years.
And
Yeah,
Mr.
thank
Chair,
you.
but before we go into public comment, I also just wanted to, I hope I have done this in every meeting, but I also wanted to take a minute just to thank all of you. It is summer and it isn't easy to bring everybody together. We were hoping to have this meeting in person, but it was hard to get a quorum. So I'm very grateful that everybody is willing to take time out of your busy work and summer vacation schedule to jump into these meetings. And I want to be very, very clear that no agency will be blindsided by this process. As we've talked about the follow-up meetings we want to make sure we're getting all the feedback, not just from you, but from any stakeholder that has remaining questions. And we want to continue working with you and with all of our partners to review the data, test the methodologies, really ensure we're looking at the system and the funding model as a whole, not just through the lens of any one agency. And I think we have a great foundation of work that's been done to build upon here. And I just want to say that I look forward to working with everyone as we move things forward.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks for those comments. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move to public comment then. Do we have speaker cards or indications of individuals who'd like to say something?
I do see that we have a hand up.
Okay, so if I can just make a comment to begin, and that is that we appreciate that what we've had in front of us today for consideration is complex and has lots of implications. I think in order to have the maximum benefit from your comments, if you can keep your comments today to the more general and follow up with an email perhaps or a letter to TSDAC for so that we have in front of us the points you make in the clearest way, that would really be helpful. So let's Bob Schneider.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate all the hard work that this group has put in together. I have, in addition to the verbal comments that I'm going to provide, I have a longer written form. Sent that to the DRPT staff to make it a little easier for them to do any comments or transcription, et cetera. And I've also sent it to all the members of the TSDAC committee that I had email addresses for. So none of this should be new if you've seen your email over the past few minutes. My name is Bob Schneider, the Executive Director of the Potomac and Rappahannock Transportation Commission in Woodbridge, Virginia, which many of you know as OmniRide. We operate one of the larger commuter fleets on the East Coast, in addition to operating local service in Prince William area. Our service area extends from Front Royal to Washington, D.C., and then south to below Fredericksburg. 6.5 years ago, the General Assembly mandated a performance measurement program we now know as MERIT. I believe it was 7.5 years ago. And when it created a floor on the state motor fuels tax in 2018. Back then, TSDAC and DRPT lamented the handcuffs of a 6-month turnaround. But in August 2025, we are repeating the same hastily structured mistakes, but with a self-imposed timeline. The process matters. In 2018, there were wild swings between the scenarios as the state and its consultants pulled different levers over and over until it found a formula they could, quote, live with. It wasn't purely methodical because it was parsed from data that at least everyone reported, and it was what they had to work with. Okay, understood. There was 6 months, but 7 years later, we still don't have the data for the original variables that DRPT and TSDAC really looked at, but were forced to ignore because of the lack of data consistency. And instead, we have a repeat of 2018. Levers get pulled partway, all the way, then put back, once again with wild swings and scenarios, all based on an originally flawed formula from 7 years ago due to the limited data, and all hoping we get some number everyone can live with. At least in 2018 and 2019, there was more time and more transparency that allowed the flaws to be partially remedied. When today's presentation materials were released last week, PRTC filed a Freedom of Information request to get the data because we were initially denied for the reason that Secretary Robinson expressed. However, or Director Robinson, excuse me, trying not to promote her unduly. But we were initially denied just due to that reason. But the great news, did receive that information yesterday at 3:53. So we're still waiting for additional information, but we don't have the time or ability to conduct the rigorous analysis that resulted in very meaningful suggestions that help the state dodge a bullet by accidentally undermining its own service on the state toll roads and the industry-leading commuter choice program for I-95, 395, and I-66. 7 years ago, it was just I-95. Now there is I-66, 395, and FredX. If we looked at today's current formulas, you would assume TSDAC, DRPT, and CTB do not value efficiency or cost recovery in transit. There is no plus up in the $10 million in fares that OmniRide collects, nor their incentives for the fact that we have been locally funding our zero fare local service. Instead, the state gives away extra funding under this model to systems that haven't helped sustain themselves. The irony is that the majority of the I-95, 395, and I-66 express funding isn't even tax dollars. It's user fees generated by the toll payers who opt into the toll lanes, including tolls and fares. You include those tolls and fares, we recover more funding than any other transit system in the Commonwealth by proportion, possibly by total dollar amount. At its core, the first two letters of TSDAC is transit service, and this committee shouldn't lose sight of demanding a more robust set of priorities from the start and using this time to effectively build the case for what is excellence in service. We can have excellent transit for the county roads, the high capacity corridors, the college campuses, and the city blocks that make up the Commonwealth's unique communities. Please take the time to demand high standards and transparent data, and please read my full text of comments that I've emailed and that I've asked to be included in the record, as there is much more to add. Thank you for your diligence. We will continue to do follow-up with data and communication, including to our representatives among non-representatives of our direct area with the CTB. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mitchell Smiley.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I'd like to just note that I appreciate the work of this group and the consultants, Director Robinson. I really think that you made a great point that this is a very difficult conversation. It's very hard to work through this amount of data, and I think we share that both of us might have to have a lot of analytic data explained to us several times. So this doesn't come naturally to me either. I think that it would be probably appropriate to have additional meetings either with TSDAC or VML-VACO members, perhaps a webinar with VML-VACO and VTA to explain some of these metrics. But it sounds like from the TSDAC members, from Kate, Cindy, and others today, that there's an interest in really getting into this data and unraveling why these metrics and why not those metrics. But I think that this conversation could really benefit from a deep dive, as some folks have mentioned today, into this data, similar to what OIP does on Smart Scale on a biannual basis. I think OIP does an excellent job really pulling apart how these metrics work specifically on the Smart Scale side. And I think that over here at TSDAC, we could really benefit from a similar, really drilling down beyond today's sort of overview of what the impacts of these changes would be, but looking behind the curtain and seeing what those data priorities are, because I think that, as Dr. Smoot said, and as Director Robinson said, this really is important. It is important that we get performance metrics correct. And it's really important that we use Virginia's limited transit dollars effectively and efficiently for the benefit of all riders as well as all transit providers in Virginia. And I know that VACO and VML, both our conferences, are probably too late for this to be the topic of a session if a public comment period is going to be had, which it sounds like it's not certain if that's the case yet. But I think, on VML's side, we certainly look forward to working with you on how to get the word out about some of these changes that are under consideration. And I will certainly, Mr. Chair, send this in an email comment as well to I don't know if I should send it to Dr. Robinson or all the TSDAC members. I'm happy to send it to wherever it can be disseminated most effectively.
Thank you. I think if we can have it sent to DRPT and ask that it be circulated to the TSDAC members, that would be helpful. And thank you, Mr. Smiley. I should parenthetically note that Mr. Smiley's mother was responsible for getting me on this committee to begin with. And speaking of people who have a direct relationship to the chair, James Hutzler is representing VACO. James.
Thank you, Supervisor. James Hutzler, Virginia Association of Counties. I wanted to echo a lot of what my colleague, Mr. Smiley, said. I tried to give my best imitation of a DRPT presentation to the VACO Transportation Committee. There's a lot of data to go through, as has been discussed multiple times, but I really wanted to focus on how some of the proposed changes would affect different regions of the Commonwealth, different individual agencies. Really, the main concern that we have coming into this is obviously the creation of winners and losers, the funding changes. There was any way to find a hold harmless, or I know you have to go through legislation for that, but we're just getting some input that's very concerned about the funding impacts at a time where these transit agencies obviously aren't, rolling around and funding. So appreciate you listening to my comments, and look forward to possibly working with DRPT and others, and appreciate your leadership. Appreciate your leadership, Mr. McGlennon.
Thank you very much, James. Anybody else who would like to participate in public comment? Going once? Going twice? And I will close the public comment. Any last words? I'll first turn to Director Robinson. Anything else that you'd like us to hear today?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I typically don't make it a habit of responding to public comment, because there's always information that comes that we want to take a minute to digest and work through with our team. And we have follow-up meetings planned. But if you don't mind, I'd like to make some just brief remarks and comments to what we just heard. Specifically to Dr. Snyder. Let me preface this by saying I greatly appreciate all the public comment and all feedback in this meeting by the members and by all our stakeholders in one-off calls and meetings that we have had and are having. However, I want to correct the record for Mr. Snyder on one particular point, because DRPT did not and has not ever, under my leadership, denied anyone access to data. And I understand his perception here, but I just want to be really clear that when we received a request for data, we responded by offering an in-person meeting after this public TSDAC meeting so that we could walk through the data and give context, just as we had done with other entities that asked for meetings. So we did that for two reasons: because we wanted to be consistent in our response. And as we talked about earlier, this data is very complex, and we wanted to make sure agencies had the context to go through it. However, upon learning that PRTC wished to have the data prior to the TSDAC meeting, we immediately responded, worked with our consultants to get that data to him yesterday within the FOIA timeline. So it's a little bit semantics and wording, but I want to make sure everyone understands we would never deny data, and we plan to post the data for everyone to see after this meeting. We wanted to respect the TSDAC process and the members and show it all publicly first, and talk through the additional scenarios and answer all the questions from previous meetings. To Mr. Hutzler's comment about a hold harmless, we looked into that, I think, in the past. We are looking into that into the future, should a recommendation move forward. And I wanted to just tag onto that and remind everyone that the implementation timeline that would be suggested by our team for any recommendations that move forward would not be until FY28. And the reason for that is because our team has actually already started putting together webinars and applications for the coming FY27 grant round. So we would use the coming year to educate and run additional scenarios and make sure everyone fully understood and was prepared for implementation in FY28. I wouldn't want anyone to think we're going to jump into it in the current cycle. We're going to give everyone time to understand it, and certainly we could look into other mechanisms through that process. And to Mr. Smiley's point, boy, do I wish we had access to all the staff resources that OIFI and VDOT have. We would do some of the same things, but I like your suggestion, and we will certainly look into ways to accommodate not only follow-up meetings, but making sure our analysis of the data is available to everyone that wishes to review it. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director Robinson. Anybody else have any final words before we close up for today? Obviously, there seems to be a good deal of interest in another meeting, and so we'll be, I'm sure, coordinating, figuring out where and when we can possibly do that in a timely fashion. Hearing nobody else with anything that they desperately want to say at this moment, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Moved second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none. Thank you all very much. Look forward to seeing you either in person or through this wonderful technology that is so easy to handle. And I'm surprised that about 20 minutes in, my camera suddenly started working. So that's great.
Always good to
Bye
see
now.
you.